My favorite type of books are classics, and today I want to take you through 10 of my favorite classics, but there's a twist. They're all easy to read and very short. So I'm hoping today I can provide some recommendations for people that want to start reading classics or they're beginners with classics. All these books are under 200 pages or thereabout, and I have a range of books here for like a wide variety of readers and what people prefer when it comes to genres and stuff like that, so hopefully there is something for everybody. So firstly, if you are into poems, if you're into beautiful language and prose, if you're into music and lyrics and stuff like that, I highly recommend to start with The Book of Longing by Leonard Cohen. This book is one of the only classics I've read that's just full of poems and sketches and stuff like that from Leonard himself, and this book I read when I was around 18 and it was a very, very, very easy read, partially because obviously poems don't take up the whole page, so it's very quick. You feel like you're flipping through the pages quite quickly and you're really like getting through an orange penguin. But secondly, the actual poems themselves, sometimes I struggle with poetry. I find it's like a little too metaphorical and I don't understand what's going on. But this collection, I actually understood what he was talking about most of the time. And I'm not a big poetry person, like I struggle with poetry. So for me to have come out the other side of this understanding it, I feel like it is safe to recommend this if you are looking for beginner classics and you also like poetry. Or even if like you want to get into poetry, you don't have to like poetry already. I don't like poetry and I read this book. So this book clocks in at around 229 pages. However, I don't count this as being over 200 pages just because like the pages can sometimes just look like this. So there's actually not that much text on each page a lot of the time, and sometimes there's just a lot of like illustrations and stuff like that, which is also really nice. Like some pages, it's literally like you're reading poems that are just written down by Leonard himself and it's not even in text. So it really breaks up the reading experience, I find, and this was just something that was very easy to read while I was on holiday. It was just a nice like beachside read or a poolside read, so I recommend it for summer vibes. Next is in my top 5 books of all time. I love this book. This book I just recommend to anyone and everyone that wants to read. I think it's just a must, and it is Animal Farm by George Orwell. This book is only about 113 pages, I believe. Yep, 113 pages. This is one of the shortest books on this list. It is so easy to read. The English is very, very simple. The story is quite fast-paced as well. A lot goes on. The plot is interesting. You're just following this group of farm animals and what happens when they overtake a farm from the farmer and try to run it themselves, essentially. It's very interesting, and the last page of this book is one of my favorite pages of literature that I've read in my entire life. So if you haven't read this or you haven't been spoiled for this, oh my god, I am so jealous of you that you could read this for the first time. You just need to read this. If you have never read this before, you need to experience reading this for the first time. I wish I could go back and experience reading this for the first time because it still blows me away just thinking about it. Very short and easy English. Anyone could read this book very easily. And not just that, it is a classic and it's literally one of my favorite classics I've ever read in my entire life. So yes, please read it. Next, a book that ties in with Japanese literature. I am a big fan of Japanese literature. Murakami is my favorite author of all time. I'm really getting into Ishiguro as well. This guy, Mishima, he's not exactly like them. He's not as contemplative, but it's still got that same sort of Japanese feel to it. This is set in a seaside Japanese town, I believe, and it follows a gang, not a gang, but a group of some boys that can be quite savage. Trigger warning for this, that there is a little bit of animal harm in this book, which really did not sit well with me. But apart from that, I thought that this book was quite good. It's around 177 pages. There is not much text on each page at all. And the thing with Japanese literature, I find, is that the translation from Japanese to English, it creates quite simple English, but also very poetic English, if that makes sense. For instance, with Murakami, I think that's a great example of that happening. But I just find that there's something like special about the language that is translated from Japan to English. It's just got this its own special vibe to it that is not different in this. It has the exact same vibe that I love so much about Japanese literature. So I highly recommend this if you're into Japanese culture at all. This is one of the like classics of Japanese art. Also, if you are interested in reading a book from an author that is quite controversial, that had a very intense, weird life, then Mishima is a guy that you want to look up and read his Wikipedia for sure. This book, by the way, is called The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea. Next, we have horror. So horror is my favorite genre of all time. So yeah, some of this is slightly skewed towards horror, a couple of these picks here, but you know, horror is one of the best genres of all time, period. But for now, we're going to talk about one of my favorite horror gothic classics, and that is We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. So I have not actually read anything else by Shirley Jackson, but this book made me want to. And I think that's a really good beginner spot, a book that makes you feel like you want to read more. Because I just had such a good experience reading this book. It's around 140 pages or so. So on the shorter side as well, like all these books. I would say that maybe this is slightly more dense than the other picks, but at the same time, the language is not that hard to understand. If you are into horror, then I think that will be enough to get you into this book if you are a beginner to classics. And if you have watched the movie Mother, which is a movie I love. Oh my god, this movie is so good. But this book actually, it feels like Mother was inspired by this book, honestly. So if you're into movies like Mother that are very like psychological horror, I think you'll also really like this book. It's very similar. Read this if you're a horror fan, please. Talk to me about it. The next book is our little dive into children's classics, because children's classics are classics too. This is The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. This guy is amazing. This book is so good. This is like pretty much a classic in the sense of like you would expect nearly every kid to have read it, but I actually never read it as a kid. So my first experience reading this book was last year. I loved it so much. I can't wait to read it again. I'll be reading it again soon for another video coming up, which is exciting. But I had a very good experience with this book. There's a lot of like cute life lessons in this book, and the little boy you follow, Little Prince, is so adorable. And you just meet like a range of different characters in every chapter, and it's just like something new every chapter in the sense of like a new thing to learn. And I just think if you want something that's like very retrospective and just like makes a lot of comments about what it is to like live and be a human, like this is the book to read. And it is a book you can read to children, so that's also a plus as well. I had a very nice experience with this book. And in the same vein as that, another children's classic that I absolutely love in the fantasy realm, if you're a fantasy fan, is The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. This is a great book to read if you're a fantasy fan. Fantasy fan in the sense of like, you know, maybe you like other worlds, you know, world building, mythical creatures, and maybe you watch some fantasy shows or movies or something like that, then I really recommend this book. Obviously, I don't recommend this to people that read huge fantasy novels, because I feel like you already can go read some classics if you're reading big fantasy novels. For people that aren't into reading but like fantasy, this is the book I would recommend. This book is a lot of fun. There's so much packed into it. If you have watched the movie but you haven't read the book and you feel like you want to go back to that movie, I'd recommend you to go read this book instead of watching the movie, because books can be even better than movies. I'm telling you, there's like so much more detail packed into books a lot of the time. Just like the world building that happens with fantasy novels is just like something else. There's also like little pictures in this one, and there's also pictures in The Little Prince, because a lot of the time with children's classics you'll find that there's illustrations, which also helps break up the reading experience like it does in the Book of Longing. So I really recommend picking this up as well. And it's 197 pages. Under 200 pages. The next book I recommend is another one of my favorite classics of all time. This probably is the most olden style English you'll find out of all these recommendations, so it's probably like on the bottom side of this list in regards to what you should start. But The Great Gatsby is a really good beginner when it comes to classics in my opinion as well. This is obviously by F. Scott Fitzgerald, one of the most popular classics of all time. It's pretty much on every beginner's list for classics because it is actually so easy to read. So this comes in at 172 pages. I actually recently did a book club read for this book with a group of my friends who usually aren't the biggest classic readers, and they all read it and they all enjoyed it and got something out of it. And that sort of confirmed to me, like, you know, this book isn't that difficult to read. As long as you're up for a little bit of a challenge, then I would recommend this book. I think it's a nice stepping stone past any of these other books. I would go to The Great Gatsby next, because overall the characters in this book are just like so insane. Like, Gatsby is intense. There's just so much to like love and hate about him at the same time. Daisy, there's so much to hate. This book just really sucks you in to this world in the 1920s. For instance, also, if you've watched the movie and you liked the movie, you could check out the book, you know, if you want to read a classic. So there you go. The next classic comes in at 151 pages. It's A Single Man by Christopher Isherwood. I actually read this in year 11 for literature class, but honestly it was the most basic book we read for literature class. Like, it was one of the only books I actually understood when we were analyzing it. I still remember reading the first page of this book and being blown away by how Isherwood like sets up this book, and its feel is crazy. Like, the atmosphere is so strong. It's written very simply but also really differently than most other books, so I really recommend it if you want something a little different. This book is about a gay man whose partner has passed away and he's dealing with being by himself, being alone. There's a lot of isolation in this book and a lot of grief. So if you're into that, if you're into something a bit more sad and bleak, then this is the book to go to. I really need to reread this, honestly. It's been way too long. And it's also a movie with Colin Firth, is it? Colin Firth, yep. The next book is the only book that's over 200 pages on this list, and it's The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. But there is a reason I recommend this book, and it's because I think it just ticks so many boxes. Even though it's a bit longer, I feel like this book feels a lot more modern than most classics, just because like I feel like Sylvia Plath was just so ahead of her time. Just love this book so much. If you're like into fiction about women, if you're into contemporaries, if you're into books that deal with mental health, then this is the classic for you. I know there's a lot of people out there that are into YA, but they're not into classics, but I really feel like this is a good stepping stone over to classics, because Sylvia Plath just creates such a relatable character in Esther, who's the main character. Sylvia Plath puts a lot of herself into the main character, which I think is why she creates such a relatable character here. And overall, this book is just so interesting, so many metaphors. So if you're into metaphors, I really recommend this book as well. Overall, like, I'm not a huge person that's into metaphors, so I did struggle slightly understanding that, but as long as you can understand metaphors, you'll probably like this book. I really want to give this a reread soon as well on my channel, so I'm really excited about doing that, because I read this book when I was like maybe 16, and I feel like I'll be able to relate to it a lot more in my 20s. So I feel like also if you're in your 20s and you want to read classics, I think this is a book you should consider. I think she did a lot of poetry as well, yes, but I'm not a huge poetry fan, so this is sort of my Sylvia Plath that I've got here that I hold on to dearly. And then the last book I want to recommend is a book that I discovered last year that blew me out of the water. Like, I didn't expect this book to be so highly appreciated by me, but it was a 5 out of 5 stars. I think it was the only 5 I gave to a classic last year. It's The Island of Dr. Moreau by H.G. Wells. Oh, this book was so good when I read it. It is 100 and something. It's 108 pages, very short. I was able to read it during a week where I read 7 books in 1 week last year during one of my readathons, and it was very easily read within a few hours for me. It starts off slightly slow is the only thing I would say about this book that maybe would be a little difficult, so you have to have a bit of patience within the first few chapters, but once you hit that island, this book is so good. And there's just so much intrigue of what's going on this island. It just feels so weird, so random, and before you know it, you're thrown into some horror, but also like sort of sci-fi as well at the same time. So there's a few different genres being fused into one here in this book, so if you're into horror or sci-fi, I would recommend this. This book is so influential. It pops up so many times in other media after it was written. It's just pretty cool to read this book back and to discover all those references to other pieces of art that I love. And overall, I just recommend this highly if once again you're a horror fan or if you're a sci-fi fan. This book can be a little bit gruesome, which is awesome for me. I loved it. You know, it's got a bit of like an Animal Farm vibe. It's also got a little bit of like a Lord of the Flies vibe. It's got a little bit of a Frankenstein vibe. It's got everything. And I think it came before all of them, if I'm not mistaken, but I might be wrong. I'll check that. I'll double check that fact. I was just blown away by H.G. Wells here. I've also read Invisible Man by him. It just wasn't the same, but this book, just like the story, just provided so much intrigue for me. I think that what makes a classic really good is like if it doesn't bore you half to death. The problem with a lot of classics is they can be so boring and long and dense, so I'm trying to provide some classics here that are plot driven and are short, you know, so you're never really bored, hopefully, by these books. So yeah, I really recommend this book. You may have to struggle for a few chapters, but you gotta trust me, it's such a good book in the end. This could be like a stepping stone over to so many other books, like I mentioned with Lord of the Flies and Frankenstein, stuff like that, other classics. So really good start here with this shorter novel. This book can also be like maybe a little bit more descriptive, a bit more paragraph heavy, so you got to be ready for that, but the overall like language is not too difficult to understand, so you should be alright. So yeah, those are the 10 books that I recommend for beginners and classics that are short and easy to read. I hope you have found a book that interests you, that you would like to read. Let me know if you've read any of these books or if you recommend any other short, easy classics to read. I would love to one day do like a 10 fic classics recommendations, because I do want to get around to like some really fic classics. Like Crime and Punishment is a book I want to read very, very soon, so that should be a lot of fun. So I definitely want to give some love to some fic classics in the future, so look forward to that as well as I dive into some more big books. But yeah, for now, those are my short, easy reads. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you soon. Bye!